In this series of slides, I want to talk about the concept of healing and in particular using chronic migraine as an example of how this might be applied in practice. First of all, my disclosures, and apart from this being good practice, I just want to make the point that I'm not some aging new age hippie, but I take a very pragmatic approach to this area and in fact work quite closely with a number of pharmaceutical companies. But before we start, some health warnings. This is really very much work in progress, and my aim is to talk around the subject, offering you some ideas and perspectives. It's very theory heavy and the road is rather a long and winding one, and it is evidence-based light for reasons I will articulate slightly later. But before we go any further, let's just get to grips with what we actually mean by this concept of healing. And it's nothing magical or spiritual. All I'm using healing for here is the intrinsic ability of the body to attain its normal function. And perhaps we can divide our approaches to our patients in two halves. First of all, transactional interventions. This is medical treatment or procedures, and what we might call transformational interventions, where we create a context for them to mobilize the intrinsic ability of their bodies to attain its normal function. And indeed, we don't have far to go to look for healing in action. This is the results of the new wonder drugs for migraine, very significant development. These drugs have been in development now for the last 30 years or so, and they've come to market and they've been a very significant difference to people's lives. And you can see they all work really well. This is the 50% response rates at 12 weeks in episodic and chronic migraine of those drugs that are licensed orally. And although there's a very good active response, you can see that there's also a very significant placebo rate as well. And indeed, the placebo is invariably seen as an inconvenience in an otherwise perfect study design. And once the statistical significance has been assessed and proven, off we can go and license and market the product. But no one is actually asking, well, hang on a sec, what's going on here with this placebo effect? How can we utilize it to benefit the drug effect? And that's really what I want to talk about and expand upon. And indeed, we can look at the placebo effect in a number of other clinical areas, or most clinical areas indeed. This is rheumatoid arthritis. This is not going to be a talk about placebo effect, but I just want to illuminate some of these other areas. So in rheumatoid arthritis, for example, meta-analysis of pooled clinical endpoints estimated about a 29% placebo response in rheumatoid trials. And you also get significant reductions in objective inflammatory markers that cannot be explained away either by regression to mean or simple neurological processes of prediction and conditioning. The placebo effect in cancer is a lot smaller. Clearly, there's a positive effect on symptom improvement, but it's actually quite difficult to look for objective tumor responses. But in the areas where that is obtainable, the responses are between about 1 or 3%, so they're much smaller. So our current approaches to placebo are, it's an unnecessary but necessary inconvenience. We set it within the framework of expectation and conditioned responses. Placebo seems to be rather a stigmatized term. We don't like using it. We sweep it under the carpet as soon as we can. I think the problem is with this concept of placebo, it inhibits exploration of other approaches and mechanisms that might be useful to us. I haven't done a grand round since I was a medical student, and in those days we used to have a patient that was wheeled in and we'd talk around the patient. So I want to offer you a grand round patient, and that is one who has chronic migraine. That's headache on 15 days at least of the month, of which 8 are migrainous. So this is a 35-year-old, headache on most days of the month, BMI, overweight, smoking, on SSRI for depression, irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia, past history of domestic abuse, You might think, when this comes in usually on a Friday afternoon late, help get me out of here. These are hugely rewarding people to treat. And I want to chat through how we might approach this problem more holistically from a healing perspective. Just by way of background, migraine, about 40% of the population have, usually the majority of people have episodic migraine, but 1 to 2% of the population will be like this person, will have chronic migraine. Overall, migraine is 6th in the world in terms of disability in adults. It's probably much higher in females. And in those people under 25, migraine is number 2, or headache is number 2 more correctly, in world disability in terms of disability adjusted life years. So it's a very significant unaddressed problem with huge unmet need. You might well say, well, I'm a surgeon and it's all a bit of a nonsense. I don't need all this stuff. Well, in fact, I'm going to talk about therapeutic relationship later, but there is a significant benefit to thinking more clearly about the relationship we have with patients that can improve them. But there's a whole range of studies now looking at the benefit of nature immersion and expediting healing using different aspects of environmental exposure. And this is an interesting randomized trial. Patients were randomized to beds either looking at a brick wall or looking at outside the window at trees and wherever possible countryside, and patient-reported outcomes, pain and time to going home was significantly shorter in people who weren't looking out at a brick wall. Now you could say, well, they just felt better because they had a nice view. That's not rigorous enough. I think we need to explore that in some more detail. But the point I want to make is these insights, I think, are relevant for all patients, whatever medical interventions they receive. So this is the outline of my talk. I want to start off with this concept of paradigm, how we're all entrapped in our rather rigid worldviews, and just very briefly touch upon some philosophy of how we see the world. The second section, we want to focus in on some definitions of what we actually mean by holistic, a new definition for health, and the distinction between complicated and complex. Section 3 is where we go into some theory, and it is quite theory heavy, I'm afraid. I want to talk about general systems theory and then focus in on systems biology before then moving on to how holistic practices might work, using migraine as an example. And finally, I would like to share with you what holistic management of chronic migraine might look like in practice. So it's a bit of a long and winding road. It's very theory heavy, but with some practical implications at the end. So here's my theoretical framework. Let me put this up at the front so at least you know where I'm trying to go. So I'm going to define health as a reduction of disorder in a system, which I think is a much more rigorous way of looking at it. I'd like to draw upon modern systems biological thinking, which suggests that we minimize disorder by acting on predictions of what will happen and minimizing our predictive error. Prediction is a function of information, and information is exchanged between systems most appropriately when they're both connected and coherent. So that's my theoretical framework on which I want to start building my model. But first, let's start with the concept of paradigm. And I really want to address the question to ourselves as, are we entrapped in our own worldviews? So our starting point here is to look at two philosophical approaches to how we see the world, positivism and post-positivism. So for the positivist, there is a real world out there. Knowledge is certain and value free. The truth really is out there. The post-positive takes a rather different position. There may well be a real world out there, but our knowledge can only be provisional. Lord knows what's actually happening out there. We only have sensory apparatuses that has evolved to look at certain modalities, and the world might be teeming with other stuff we're not really aware of. Interesting to note that modern science still doesn't know what 80% of the universe is made from. This dark matter or dark energy is possibly out there, but not unknown. So there are big gaps in our knowledge. And the post-positive would say, well, we have to do the best we can, but we can never know for certain what is out there. For the positivist, there's only one model of the world, and that's very straightforward. For the post-positivist, there are many models. All models are approximations. Some we may find useful at some times and others at other times. So for the positivist, maths and physics reflect really how the world is, whereas for the post-positivist, maths and physics are human constructions that identify regularities that are useful to us. Reality is objective and can be discovered through observation and experiment for the positivist. For the post-positivist, it's very much influenced by context, bias and perspective, and I think the aphorism came from Maslow: to a man with a hammer, everything will be a nail. I think this is a good example of the difference between a post-positivist and a positivist. So these are currently our three models of the universe: at the very small, quantum physics; in the intermediate, Newtonian mechanics; and at the level of the cosmos, Einstein relativity, space-time. And all these models are very useful, and they've got very useful predictive ability in their own particular scales, but they are totally ununifiable, and physicists and mathematicians strain away to try and get some sort of unified model that will bring them all together, alas, in vain. Whereas the post-positivist would say, yeah, these are useful models, but there is no underlying overarching model. There is no fundamental principle of matter. These are all human constructs. So the positivist sits within a paradigm, and this concept was described by Kuhn in a very influential book in 1962 on the nature of scientific revolutions. And Kuhn said that science doesn't move forward on a broad front. We are entrapped within our rigid ways of looking at the world, and these paradigms are consolidated by our associations, the professions we build up, the journals we put our work in, the colleges we belong to, the research grants and grant-giving bodies that we set up, the language we use to describe the world, the experimental tools we use to describe the world. And careers are very much based on paradigms, so we're very reluctant to let go of them. And what Kuhn said, that paradigms are usually pretty strong and resilient, but if reality is challenged, and their reality is challenged, they may suddenly fragment, and there can be a sudden shift towards a different paradigm. But at the moment, we're very much stuck since the Age of Enlightenment, since the 17th century, in the paradigm of modern science. The paradigm has had a really useful technique. It's evolved more recently, which is to set up a protective belt of satellite programs. This is where it can accommodate some challenges to the paradigm, but it keeps them well out of harm's way in satellite programs in a protective belt, and the underlying central core of the paradigm nevertheless remains very solid and well preserved. I've spent a career, a very privileged career indeed, trying to assault paradigms with, of course, no success whatsoever. Although in the early days I did have some moderate success with Fortress Health Economics, but with modern science to no avail. Let me give you a personal example of this. And one of my privileges is that I've been able to operate as a GP on the wrong side of the tracks in St Thomas's without any academic constraints. So I've not really had to worry about what I say, or if I even know what I'm talking about, which half the time I'm not really quite so sure, but it hasn't really made much of a difference. So I've been able to operate as a guerrilla fighter, which has been a great privilege. So I published this paper back in 20 years ago in 2000. It was in the leading migraine journal, Migraine: New Perspectives from Chaos Theory. I suggested that there is a very new way of looking at migraine, and indeed all other medical problems, that complement the existing frameworks, and these may more accurately reflect underlying physiological mechanisms. And the reviewers thought this was really very, quite a useful, significant challenge. But the paper has been complete. The paper, of course, might have been rubbish. I'm quite happy to accept that, but it has been completely ignored, and the paradigm has carried on, irrespective of some quite useful insights coming from other ways of thinking about how the world might work. And that's true not just for migraine, but for all other clinical areas. Chaos has in fact been termed the mother of physiology, but its imprint on medical science has been negligible to date. So I want to finish off this first section with a really nice quote from William Blake. He was an artist, poet, turn of the 1800s. May God keep us from single vision and Newton's sleep. Newton, the father of the Enlightenment and modern science, of course. So you may just like to reflect upon that, whether you were under the spell of Newton, and I see my role perhaps as Prince Charming to you, your metaphorical Sleeping Beauty, and my role is to try and awaken you with a metaphorical kiss. So that's section 1. Are we entrapped in our paradigms? Section 2, some definitions. Let's try and be clear about what we're talking about. The first thing I want to look at is this difference between complicated and complex, which is quite an important difference for my story. It's quite interesting to reflect on how we use these terms very differently. It's always worth going back to the Latin. Com with, plica with folding. The inference being these are systems that we can unfold and understand by breaking them down into their component folds, whereas complex is complexus, systems that are entangled or braided together, and we are unable to do this. So complicated systems are linear, that is, you can understand the system by breaking it down into its component subsystems. Additivity applies, whereas nonlinear systems, you cannot do this. The second definition I want to unpack is this concept of holistic. We take this from the Greek, meaning holos, whole, and there are two separate distinctions here I want to be clear about. Holistic, the difference between a holistic approach and holistic practices. And also note that we get our terms healing and health from the root holistic. So an holistic approach is one that utilizes a range of disciplines, including medical, lifestyle, environmental, and holistic practices, whereas a holistic practice is a range of transformational approaches that view systems as complex, and the aim of holistic practices is to facilitate an interconnectedness between the parts of the complex system. So here are some of the most commonly used healing approaches. I've separated acupuncture and therapeutic relationships slightly, but I think the important point to say about all these healing approaches is they all have an emerging evidence base, and they all find their place in mainstream NHS practice, whether it be in psychological practice, in pain clinics or chronic disease clinics. You can find all these techniques. So what might be the physiological effects of healing approaches? Well, as I said, I don't think this simple conditioning that we talk about with placebo is particularly helpful, because there are a wide range of other direct physiological effects that we can measure. They have impact upon autonomic activity, chaos, signature activity, heart rate variability being the most common one, and you can find this indeed in your smart watches. You can identify brainwave activity changes and network interconnectedness and activity, and also measure changes in hormone and immune markers. So quite a widespread variety of physiological effects that can be induced by holistic practices. So how do the characteristics of holistic practice differ from medical practice? Well, perhaps the most important one is medical practice. We die to dissect. We take systems down to the lowest level that we can, ideally genetic and molecular. We focus on an analysis at the lowest level of the system. whereas a holistic practice will be interested in more higher system levels. From a medical perspective, medical practice perspective, systems are complicated. I'll say a little bit more about the difference between that in a minute. Whereas the focus is on interconnectedness and systems that are complex in holistic practice. In medical practice, our focus is on generalizability, statistical inferences from large groups of people. It doesn't say anything about the individual, whereas holistic practice will focus on what works for the individual, what is important for the individual. For medical practice, focuses on restoration of function, fighting the disease, battling the cancer, whereas from a holistic perspective, our focus is more on harmony with our challenges. Medical practice set within Western scientific traditions, all the holistic practices come to us from Eastern traditions, India and China. So these are three of the main challenges from Fortress Scientifica. It's all in the mind. Well, you could argue that everything is in the mind. Whatever it is, everything originates in the mind. That's not a position I would take, because I would raise the question, what actually is the mind anyway? And to start unpacking the mind, you'd have to start unpacking the nature of consciousness, which to my knowledge no one has got anywhere near at the present time. And indeed, dualism, this concept that the mind is separate from the body just supports the mind which sits in the brain, is now very much old hat, and that's given away to this concept of embodiment. The mind and body are actually one unit. Where's the evidence for all of this? Well, evidence is indeed emerging, but to me, I actually think we can't impose a framework of scientific evidence on holistic practice. It's a bit like saying we're testing a placebo against a potential placebo. So I think we need a different approach to evidence. There is a suggestion that holistic practice is peddled by this huge array of snake oil salesmen, and patients are vulnerable. Well, medicine has certainly not been without its challenges in this area. I would refer you to the classical book by Ivan Illich, Medical Nemesis, where he coined the phrase iatrogenic medicine and identified the very significant harm that the scientific industrial complex can give to people. And indeed, there are ways which I think we can guard against exploitation from holistic practices. And these are my principles of transformational medicine. The question is, does it work for the individual? Is it attached to a story that makes sense? Is there potential for harm? And in most cases, apart from avoiding medical interventions that might help you, there is very little potential for harm. And the final question really is, does it cost anything? And for all these holistic practices, apart from acupuncture, no, it costs nothing. The medical fortress is in fact very canny, and it does accept these, as I've alluded to, it does accept these principles into its practice, but they are placed within satellite programs which are focused very much on preserving the paradigmatic core. So that's a bit about the concept of holism and holistic. Let's now start digging a little bit more rigorously into what health might mean. So the evolution of the concept of health has really unwound over the last 100 years or so. So prior to 1948, it was very straightforward. Health was maintenance of physical functioning, and it's interesting to note that in 1915, the first type of health system was the Lloyd George Insurance Act, which offered cover for working men only. So the focus was on maintaining an active workforce, or a male force, for military service. In 1948, there was a very significant shift, and we see this physical, psychological and social well-being being brought in, not just the absence of disease and infirmity, although you can see already we're beginning to have a division into paradigms, the physical, the psychological and social. We shift again in 1984. On comes this ability to this concept of flourishing. We live independently, we live a meaningful life, health is actively cultivated, and we talk about resilience, so much more broader perspective and a positive perspective to health. One of the problems with all these definitions is they're actually all relative, so they aren't particularly rigorous. So, for example, if you plot an index of, well, any health or social index, any problem, here's a composite index of health and social problems against inequality, you can see that everything is indeed relative. And those that have less inequality, there is less relativity between people, have better problems, better indices of health. So those definitions are all relative. Can we derive a more rigorous definition of health which would give us a better starting point? And I want to, in the next few slides, evolve a more rigorous definition. And our starting point here is the second law of thermodynamics, which I'm sure you're all aware is the fact that entropy increases in all closed systems. So all systems will eventually lead to a more disordered state. That includes anything down from small particles to the universe. Just want to say, I'm just going to diverge here a little because I think this is quite interesting and it just sort of sets the context for entropy. This is a systems view of how life forms and goes on, and as the entropy of a system increases, we get a transient increase in its complexity, and this is where life lives and is formed. I think a really useful demonstration of this concept is a glass of Irish coffee. So on the left, this is a very low entropy system. As you put increasing amounts of energy into it, it could be heat energy, or in this case, let's put some mechanical energy into it, stir it with a spoon with increasing rigor. Eventually, there will be a total dispersion. We will increase our entropy to its maximum amount. But somewhere in between these two states, we get this state where there are patterns, swirls. The system is held in a state of pattern complexity. And this is indeed where life is held. And our model of life sees systems as cells, organisms as dissipative systems. We take in low energy entropy in terms of the chemical bonds in food. We discharge high energy entropy in terms of heat. And by dissipating entropy, we manage to maintain stability and a non-equilibrium system with our environment. Now, on top of that, we can add the concept of autopoiesis, which I won't go into, but this maps onto complexity theory. But you begin to build up a model of life based on dissipating systems that can maintain them, a boundary with their environment, across which energy flows, and by exporting entropy, maintain this state of complexity. This is an interesting slide I came across recently, which shows the energy flux or the energy rate density through different systems with the evolution of the universe. And you can see over time, as energy rate density gets more and more larger, we get more and more complex systems, from individual atoms to stars to Milky Ways, etc., societies. And could it be that we are now reaching the top of our complexity curve, and as entropy continues to increase, we will be starting to go down the other side? And I have to say that when one looks at politics or public organisations, from the NHS to the police force, it does seem that systems are becoming more disordered, and it could well be that our energy rate density is now such that we cannot sustain this position of complexity on which we have been thriving to date. But that's by way of a diversion. Let's get back to the script. And I'm going to suggest, therefore, that health is a minimization of the rate of change to a more disordered state. A healthcare intervention is anything that reduces disorder in a system, and disorder is inhibited by information transfer or connectedness. So that's my fundamental starting point to build up my story. Interestingly, to go back to hundreds of thousands, well, thousands of years, to the ancient Chinese, they had this all sewn up thousands of years ago. They saw health as a balance between internal energies in the environment, or where there is a dynamic harmony between inner and outer worlds. So I think all we're doing is really reverting back to insights that people had thousands of years ago in the East. So that's a rather prolonged section about definitions. We now need to dig into our third section, which is going to be a little bit more theory heavy. And my aims for this section are to give a background to general systems theory, and in particular look at these two types of systems, complicated and complex. I want to outline some key concepts in systems biology, particularly complexity, free energy principle, and multi-level architecture. And this will lead me on to a suggestion of thinking about how holistic practices might work. So this is what I'm trying to say. A useful biological system is to look at biological systems as complex systems that are composed of interacting subsystems. Information transfer between these subsystems reduces a tendency to disorder, and information transfer is most effective when interacting systems are coherent. And I'm going to suggest that holistic practices facilitate the coherence or the harmony of interacting systems. And I'm going to draw upon the work of three people. These are my pin-ups: Ross Ashby, the father figure of British systems theory. Interestingly, he was a psychiatrist. Carl Friston, arguably one of the leading thinkers in neuroscience today. Again, interestingly enough, apart from being a computer scientist, mathematician, he's also a psychiatrist. And Paul Levine, who is a computer scientist and biologist, an experimental biologist. So in this section, I want to look at, in the first part, a little bit about what general systems theory is, how this can be useful to us, and focus particularly on these two types of systems and contrast between complicated and complex systems. So let's start with some systems theory. Ross Ashby, the father figure of British systems thinking. And behind all these people, I always like to look at some social vignettes. And I came across this lovely picture of the widow of Ross Ashby. And these are all the journals that he wrote at home, in which he reflected on systems thinking. And if you want to know, if you want to get an insight into the brain of a systems thinker, you can actually see these journals. You can just imagine she was just about to chuck them out into a skip, and someone says, hang on, you really should hang on to those. And these are of such national importance that they're now in the National Library, and they've all been digitalized and you can access them. So starting point of systems thinking is to nominate a boundary across which information and energy flows. Now this sounds simple, but in fact, this is our first challenging starting point. As Michael Levin suggests, the most important aspect of investigating the universe is knowing where to set our boundary, is our perspective. But once you have established a boundary, systems thinking looks at the effects of modulating boundary filters across which information and energy can flow, changing the interaction and feedback loops within the system, and changing the process algorithms or transfer functions of each node. And systems thinking sits across a taxonomy. On the one scale, we have complicated or complex systems, linear or linear systems. On the x-axis, we have systems that are hard, that is, they can be described mathematically, or systems that are soft. They invariably contain elements of human agency, where mathematics are invariably problematic and qualitative insights are important. So modern science or transactional medicine will sit in this top left-hand quadrant. Complexity thinking or transformational medicine will sit in this bottom right-hand quadrant. And just for completion, chaos theory which I think has got huge insights, sits very much in this left-hand quadrant. Non-linear approach, very much like complexity. And this is a very busy, there's far more in this taxonomy than just these three areas. And just to give you some indication, this is just a map of the complexity sciences in 2018. So you can see why we all retreat into paradigms. So let's have a look at the difference between complicated and complex systems to lead us into the biology, looking at biological systems through the lens of complexity. As we said, complex systems can be unfolded. They are homeostatic. They have a constant. They aim to achieve a constant output due to feedback, negative feedback. Change is smooth. Time is measured continuously, and we can approach them quite successfully using integral differential calculus. And here is a picture I particularly like. This is the metaphor of complicated systems or modern science as the machine, so we can understand it by breaking it down into its component parts. It is reductionist. It's linear. There's a simple relationship between cause and effect. You press on the accelerator, it goes fast. You press on the accelerator a bit more, it goes faster again. If we know where we are at any time, we know where we can be at any time in the future. It is deterministic, and it is positivistic. I particularly like this chap on the back. If we don't quite understand the system, all we need is to increase our level of analytical detail, our experiment, and the system will yield. The truth is actually there. And it moves forward. Modern science moves forward like a steamroller, flattening all before it. This is the model of complexity, a dynamic system of elements that shift, whose interactions shift with time. And the key different principle here is the interactions are reiterative. The output of one series of nodes is fed into another, which is then computed before the output goes on to another set of nodes. And feedback is both positive and negative. And this gives rise to very different features. And additivity does not apply. You can't break the system down into its component parts to understand it. So this is a system that's recently been put together for chronic migraine, and how these various factors for chronic migraine are interacting in a complex, non-linear manner. There are a large number of implications of a shift to a complexity frame of reference. Here are a few of them. Things are much more extensive, obviously, but as I've alluded to, breaking systems down to understand them is problematic. Small inputs can have large effects and vice versa. Systems can actually self-organize. Patterns emerge from local interactions, and we need to be cautious about where we set our analytical boundaries, because small inputs can have huge effects on systems very far away from them. And the classic example here is the butterfly effect. Butterfly can flap its wings in New York, and you can have a hurricane in Japan. So we may be affected by butterflies flapping their wings all over the world. So we need to be very cautious about where we set our boundaries. Nevertheless, we can set analytical boundaries, and from the perspective of information theory, we draw upon Markov, the concept of Markov blanket, which can identify internal and external states based on the elements around an adjacent element, where all the information can be contained either directly or indirectly. So I don't want to go into any of that in any more detail, but I would like to make the point that this way of thinking, for me, maps on far more appropriately to physiology and anatomy. I mean, if the brain is not a complex system, what is it? And I think offers us very useful insights. So that's an outline of some general systems theory and the difference between systems that we see as complicated and complex. Let's start unpacking now some systems biology. And our first concept is to see the body as brain body as an embodied or embedded complex system, a complex system of interacting elements across all units from our DNA up through our body brain to our environment. So this is a picture we might look at as a starting point around which of interacting nodes interacting in a non-linear reiterative fashion, around which we can put Markov blankets, organelles to cells to tissues to organs to body to environment, around which we can draw a rather arbitrary distinction of where our sense of self lies. That's a totally different way of looking at our biological system, which I think is probably more appropriate. Now, if you want to know any more about this in some detail, I put together this YouTube video, which indeed got a bit out of hand. It's gone on for about an hour and a half, I think, which gives you a bit more detail about all that sort of stuff and more, and how these nonlinear insights can offer us useful perspectives on the world. So, having established the fact that a useful model is to see the body-brain environment as one complex system, we can now draw upon Ross Ashby again and his important law of requisite variety, which says that systems interact optimally when information flow is maximum between them. And this occurs at a particular state. We can identify it mathematically, which is called self-organized criticality. And this is a state which complex systems often find themselves going to. We then bring on the work of Carl Friston, and here we start wading into much deeper water. So the current on-trend way of thinking now about how the brain and other systems of the body work is allostatic or feed-forward control. I'm afraid homeostatic control, negative feedback, is a bit old hat. And we are looking now at systems as based on feed-forward or predictive modelling. So the cause of our sensory inputs, both interoceptive and exteroceptive, are inferred based on our experience of the world, and our aim is to minimize our predictive error. So we take in inputs, we have a predictive model, and then we resense the world after a certain time frame, and it seems that the body takes in sensory information at about 10 frames a second. And if there's a predictive error, we update our predictive model. So let me give you an example of how this might work in practice. So let's look at a simple example of a car navigating a curve. So the beginner driver won't have any predictive model stored. So if the car is not moving in the right direction, there is it's a homeostatic correction to the steering. So this is a negative feedback system. It's quite energy demanding. Whereas the more advanced driver, the brain will be in predictive mode. When you see the corner, you have an idea how you need to steer around the corner based on previous experience. So you steer based on your prediction, update your prediction frequently, and if the prediction is erroneous, you actually update your model. So it's a very different way of thinking. Let me give you another example. Consider someone going upstairs. This is homeostatic control. You go up the stairs, you lower your oxygen level, your heart rate goes up, your respiration rate goes up, your oxygen level is maintained. From an allostatic perspective, the brain anticipates what its oxygen requirement will need to be. Heart and respiration rate will increase to anticipate, appropriate to its anticipated demand. The system will be sensed, the oxygen level checked, and if there is an error between what you need and what the brain thinks you need, the model will be updated. And if the predictive model can't be updated, to minimize predictive error, you can either increase your oxygen sensitivity or you can change the context. You can act on the world. So, for example, you can take an elevator. So that's a simple example of how feed-forward or allostatic control might work. So this is Carl Friston's free energy principle. Disorder is minimized with minimization of predictive error. So you could say that health is a minimization of predictive error. This is facilitated by maximizing information exchange between interacting systems, that's Ashby, This occurs when interacting systems are coherent. Now, if you want to know a little bit more about that, we get into deep water very quickly, and very good luck with that. But those are the principles on which I want to move forward. And finally, just to pull in Michael Levin's work, this is the concept of multi-scale architectural cognition, and Levin suggests and provides experimental backup to this concept that life exists in nested levels in complex systems. High levels certainly do coordinate lower levels, but each level has its own cognitive competency. So each level of organization in the complex system, each subsystem knows its desired state. It has stored patterns of where it needs to be. We could call this memory, and this can be packaged in genetic, molecular, or electrical signals. And it is able to identify a prediction error and update that predictive pattern accordingly. And finally, each of these sublevels has what he calls a cognitive cone, a spatio-temporal boundary over which it has awareness of and influence. So it can look back in time, it can look forward in time, it can look across space, and the dimensions or the extent of these dimensions vary at each level of cognition. And he does all sorts of interesting experiments to prove this point. He fiddles around with planaria or flatworms, top left. These have an interesting feature that you can just cut bits off them and they will totally regenerate. So you can give them behavioral, you can train them to do behavioral tricks, cut a little piece of tail off and the system will regenerate, and they still have the same behavioral tricks. At a high level, salamanders can regenerate most of their organs and their limbs, in fact. So if you cut a limb off, it will regenerate. So what Levin does is he can block the DNA. Don't ask me how he does that, but he blocks the DNA, cuts the limbs off, and they still regenerate, proving the principle that we have cognitive ability at different levels of scale, not just genetic and molecular. Interestingly, there is work coming through that seems to reinforce this in human systems. This is some work I came across in the female reproductive system, and there was a recent paper which suggests that ovaries has nerve cells, autonomic cells, and actually functions and can function as a system in its own right. And indeed, it has been known for some time now that the ovarian, fallopian, uterine, vaginal subsystem has its own complex neural, hormonal, and immunological local networks. So what I'm trying to say here is the focus shifts to an interacting hierarchy of subsystems in a complex system that seeks to minimize predictive error. Hierarchical levels don't have regulatory control. No level has privileged causal status. And insights and opportunities come from many levels of scale, not just molecular. So in summary, living systems must minimize the unpredictability of their actions that they undertake to achieve objectives. The prediction error is minimized by effective transfer, and in doing so, they resist the tendency to disorder. This process takes place at different levels of scale, and information is transferred optimally when systems match their complexity. That's a bit of a long and winding road to get to a very simple endpoint. I want to move on to now finally some far more practical perspectives and finish off with how this might map onto chronic migraines. So here we have our model, allostatic feed-forward control, and our objective is to minimize predictive error. What happens when our predictive model is compromised? Well, what is the main thing? This can be compromised for a number of reasons, but the current on-trend way of thinking is that this is compromised by chronic inflammation, or what is called allostatic load. There are a number of stressors that we are experiencing. This leads to a chronic inflammatory response, which has adaptive characteristics. It activates these complex systems, but over time, with multiple episodes of stressors, this load can build up and maintain an inappropriate level. And here are some of the stresses that we are all experiencing, migraine being an inflammatory process itself, I won't go through that list, but more and more we are understanding the impact of previous trauma, particularly significant childhood adverse events in people with chronic migraine. And the suggestion is that we carry around our stress buckets with us. This stress is indeed held throughout the whole body. This chronic inflammatory load, the body keeps the score, and this impacts upon our predictive modelling ability. So if our predictive model is compromised, and we need to minimize our predictive error wherever possible, and we can't do this by updating our predictive model, what can we do? Well, we can act on the world. We can change the modulation of our factors. So just as when the radio goes down, we tend to turn up the volume. So we might increase the volume of our sensory inputs, leading to more migraine, leading to irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia. We might increase the sampling frequency, which has got disadvantageous consequences for the migraineur. So how can holistic practices help us? Well, holistic practices can help by improving our information transfer, both internally and between internal and external worlds. This minimizes predictive error, and in doing so reduces disorder. So let's map this onto our migraineur. So migraine is a hypervigilant, hypersensitive state. This had evolutionary advantages. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, when we were living in nice, quiet, wide environments, and it was an evolutionary advantage to be able to spot our lunch, or to be able to spot the snake in the grass creeping up, or the lion in the grass creeping up on us as their intended lunch. We were hypervigilant, hypersensitive. Fast forward a few 100,000 years, we've got the right sort of brain, but the wrong sort of environment. You can see why people with migraine get into trouble. So how might holistic practices help migraine? Well, certainly we can address the causes of chronic inflammation by lifestyle adjustment. We can talk about gut biome, exercise, weight, appropriate diet. Processed foods, ultra-processed foods are fantastic for increasing chronic inflammation. We can look at techniques that may reduce or increase the modulation of these interoceptive and exteroceptive signals that are inappropriately coming through to us to try and minimize our predictive error. Body awareness techniques, breathing techniques, meditative practices. We can reduce our sampling frequency. Meditative techniques are particularly useful for doing this. Or we can address our inappropriate modeling by shifting to either to a more appropriate model, or such as renegotiating sense of self, emotional freedom techniques, and other techniques that we may wish to use. If we go back to where we started from, so by putting our patient in front of a window, we move him away from a situation where information transfer is compromised and there is an inability to minimize predictive error, which increases and alerts these mechanisms which may not be appropriate to our recovery. These alerting mechanisms, but by putting our bed in front of the window, we can facilitate information transfer, which reduces the stress on our predictive modeling. How does this look from a picture of the management of chronic migraine? Well, let's go back to our patient again, and this is a model I've put together. So 4 pillars underpinned by one foundation. The medical approach, the managing the external environment, facilitating interactions in the internal environment, and managing the interactions between the internal and external environment, underpinned by a foundation of reframing sense of self. So the medical column, do I have the best evidence-based medical treatment? The managing the external environment, do I have the lifestyle that is beneficial to my migraine health? And those are the sort of things we'd be talking about. Managing the internal environment, what is my body asking? Am I supporting my body to heal itself? And we will be using holistic techniques such as these. And finally, managing interactions between internal and external environment. How can I improve the harmony between my inner and outer worlds? And here we'd be talking about nature immersion, social engagement, journaling, art therapy, meditative techniques, and the therapeutic consultation. Finally, reframing sense of self. People with chronic migraine, they're frustrated, they're ashamed, they feel guilty, they're despondent. They oscillate between over-arousal and under-arousal. They develop coping strategies that are unhelpful. And we can help them reframe their sense of self using a number of holistic practices, which are all fairly mainstream. ACT therapy is now the third wave of psychological acceptance commitment therapy. I'm not going to go into any of these in any detail, just to signpost them if you want to look at them in any more detail. So finally, I just want to map this onto the therapeutic relationship between practitioner and patient. And here the suggestion is that for better outcomes, we need to complexity match between practitioner and patient. This would facilitate information transfer and the reduction of disorder. There's lots of evidence to suggest that beneficial interactions improve care, both from the primary care literature and the psychological therapy literature. So it has been suggested that the interaction and the nature of relationships is more important than the therapy itself, in fact, in psychology. From a physiological perspective, you can demonstrate mirror neurons and physiological variability, that physiological synchrony is demonstrated when interactions are seen as good ones. So there's lots of insights and evidence to suggest that the therapeutic relationship itself is part of a holistic practice for very similar reasons that I've alluded to for other practices. Unfortunately, medicine is moving towards a system of McDonaldization, and now we don't even speak to the person at the desk and say, how's your day going? We just tap in what we want on these remote machines. And of course, this is the way that policy directors are taking us. All GP consultation is going to be online. Better tech means better healthcare. We're being driven by artificial intelligence, and Elon Musk wants us all wired up to the internet as soon as he can. So I'll just leave you with this thought. The aim of the doctor is to negotiate the interface between the potential of medical science and the ability of patients to heal themselves. Should we be just loosening up our paradigms a little bit more rather than paying lip service to this healing potential, and be mindful of the fact that the way medicine is going is not going to be helpful to helping people help themselves. If you have migraine, or if you know anyone who has migraine, or if you work with migraine, I've got this website. It's not quite ready. It'll be certainly ready by Christmas. I've put together a handbook. It's quite a complicated handbook. No, it's an extensive handbook for people with migraine. It's also got an associated online course. It's all free. You can download it all for nothing. So you might just like to make a note of that, or just Google manage migraine holistically Koenig, and you'll get it. Okay, so I'm going to finish there. That was a bit long and convoluted. I hope it's left you with some food for thought.